Welcome to the first part of Kremlin Killings, Putin's tumultuous relationship with Russian tycoons. When Vladimir Putin comes to mind, the word power is often associated with him. Putin has held the reins of Russia since 1999, making him one of the most influential leaders in the country since Stalin. He's undertaken actions like military incursions into neighboring nations, meddling in U.S. election affairs, and amending the Constitution to extend his rule until 2036. However, this wasn't always the situation. During the 1990s, Russia was under the influence of oligarchs, a clique of individuals who accumulated immense wealth during the dissolution of the Soviet Union. These oligarchs held sway over the media, had many politicians in their pocket, and were instrumental in propelling Putin to power. When Putin declined to reciprocate, the oligarchs initiated a conflict against him. The Soviet Union, renowned for launching the first human into space, pioneering the first satellite, and ranking as the world's second largest economy, began to falter by the 1980s, primarily exacerbated by the war in Afghanistan. This conflict drained the Soviet budget and plunged it into a recession. The Soviet leadership attempted to modernize the economy, but these efforts came too late to salvage the declining system. Protests for independence gained momentum, leading to a wave of countries seeking to break free from the Soviet Union, mirroring the historic fall of the Berlin Wall. The Soviet economy, although enormous in scale, suffered from severe inefficiency. Despite its vast size, private ownership was prohibited, and all resources were owned by the state, with the state theoretically representing the people. That's the narrative the Communist Party propagated. The country was replete with factories churning out a wide range of products, from steel and tanks to aluminum, but the system was highly centralized. At the close of each year, any profits generated by these factories were sent to Moscow, where the capital would then redistribute the funds back to the factories based on their perceived requirements. Exactly, the system created a counterproductive incentive. If a factory spent only $100,000 out of the million it received, the Kremlin would then allocate them a budget of $100,000 the following year, assuming it was sufficient. This led to a practice where factory managers would intentionally overspend to secure a larger budget in the next fiscal year, which had negative consequences for efficiency and resource allocation. This transition led to the proliferation of numerous ineffective factories, burdening the country with debt and triggering a recession that ultimately contributed to the collapse of the Soviet Union. In the move from socialism to capitalism, the Russian government faced the daunting task of privatizing its vast array of state-owned factories, which had become a significant drain on the government's finances. To ensure that the average Russian citizen would benefit from this shift, the government devised a plan where one-third of the companies would be owned by the people, another third by the government, and the remaining third sold to investors. To achieve this, they introduced vouchers that ordinary Russians could exchange for shares in these companies. While this plan sounded promising in theory, it was susceptible to abuse in practice. For many Russians, the concept of ownership was entirely new and unfamiliar. They didn't fully grasp how it could benefit them, so they often sold their vouchers to factory managers for a fraction of their actual value, especially considering that many Russians hadn't received their wages for months and urgently needed cash to support their families. Unfortunately, this meant that the average citizens did not benefit as intended from this transition. Instead, a small group of individuals exploited the system, ultimately becoming Russia's new elite. The term oligarchs gained prominence a bit later when Russia's first president, Boris Yeltsin, sought re-election in 1996. Yeltsin's popularity was declining rapidly as the country grappled with chaos, and he faced blame for mismanaging the crisis. It was widely anticipated that he would lose the election, especially since the parliament was predominantly controlled by the communists, who were confident they would assume the presidency in the upcoming election. In a bid to salvage his chances, Yeltsin turned to the country's wealthiest bankers for support. However, the oligarchs were not willing to risk their fortunes without something in return. They sought a larger piece of the economic pie. Selling the remaining government-owned companies required parliamentary approval, which seemed nearly impossible given that the parliament was largely under communist control. During the chaotic period of post-Soviet Russia, the country's financial system was still in its infancy. Government funds were held in commercial banks, which primarily managed these funds. Seeing an opportunity, Russia's top bankers offered Boris Yeltsin a deal to secure his re-election. They would lend him $500 million at a staggering annual interest rate of 150%, taking the government's shares in the largest companies as collateral. If the government couldn't repay the loans, the banks would retain these shares. Boris Yeltsin did win the election in 1996, but, as anticipated, the government couldn't repay the debt. This marked the rise of a few individuals who effectively became the owners of Russia's largest companies. For instance, Vladimir Putin, the mastermind behind this scheme, obtained a controlling stake in Norilsk Nickel, now worth nearly $50 billion. Mikhail Khodorkovsky secured a 45% majority stake in Yukos, which by 2003 was worth billions, making him Russia's richest man. As a result, these newly wealthy individuals began amassing significant fortunes, enabling them to influence politics, media, and even attempt to control the government. However, their dominance was challenged when Vladimir Putin entered the scene. When Boris Yeltsin contemplated stepping down, Boris Berezovsky persuaded him to appoint a young KGB officer named Putin as his successor. Putin initially appeared as a compliant figure, securing Yeltsin's family's safety and fulfilling the oligarchs' requests. However, as he consolidated his power, Putin began to change the rules of the game. The oligarchs, who had control over media, vast wealth, and political influence, wanted to remind Putin of their role in placing him in power. Putin recognized that to rule Russia with a firm hand, he needed to control the press. He launched an investigation against media mogul Guzinsky, ultimately silencing the opposition by forcing him to sell his media empire to Gazprom Media for a mere fraction of its actual worth. Other oligarchs took note and opted to align with Putin, protecting their fortunes and freedom. However, not all oligarchs complied. Berezovsky, who played a significant role in Putin's rise to power, expected substantial favors in return. Instead, the government targeted his business dealings and took over his media empire. He went into exile in the United Kingdom and lost all his Russian businesses. His last hope, a court case against Abramovich, ended in failure, and he tragically passed away in 2013. With Putin firmly in control of the media and having subdued most of the oligarchs, his authority went unchallenged. The remaining powerful figure, Mikhail Khodorkovsky, with a net worth of $17 billion, attempted to buy influence and shape the country's direction. However, in a televised meeting in 2003, Khodorkovsky publicly clashed with Putin, accusing government officials of corruption and bribery. This marked the beginning of the end for Khodorkovsky. His arrest, followed by investigations into tax evasion, led to the complete elimination of his company, Yukos. He spent the next 10 years in prison. No oligarch dared to challenge Putin again, and his power grew to a point where it seemed inconceivable to imagine Russia without him. Will anyone in the future come to challenge Putin? What do you think? Stay tuned for the next video.